Good morning. Thank you, Jackie. N-word 1 does not equal N-word 2. How the CRTC got its case against Société Radio-Canada wrong. In 2020, Ricardo Lamour, a Black Montreal resident, filed a complaint with the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunication Commission against Société Radio-Canada, or SRC, the French language service of the CBC, regarding the use of the N-word during the broadcast of a radio program that year. On August 17, 2020, during the airing of a segment of Le 15 à 18, literally translated 3 to 6 p.m., that program on Radio-Canada, the N-word was used 4 times, 3 times in French and 1 time in English. The ostensibly offensive term was used in a conversation about a book by 1960s Quebec separatist militant Pierre Valliere, the title of which, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, tends to contain the N-word when typically translated into English, although some linguists and translators will argue that the N-word is not the default translation of the word in the title of the book. The broadcast focused on the controversy surrounding a Concordia University professor who cited the book's title during a class and the circulation of a petition to fire the professor for using the N-word in class. Just for some reference point, Concordia University is an Anglophone institution situated in the heart of Montreal, and Concordia classes, for the most part, are conducted in English. Lamour, who was listening to the broadcast, found the use of the word offensive and upsetting, in his words. His complaint to the CRTC contended that Radio-Canada's use of the word on air violated Canadian broadcasting values and policy. The policy says broadcast programming, and I'm quoting here, should be of high standard and should serve to safeguard, enrich, and strengthen the cultural, political, social, and economic fabric of Canada, and that the public broadcaster's programming, again quoting here, should reflect the multicultural and multiracial nature of Canada. Radio-Canada's ombudsman rebutted that employing the word while merely quoting a book title did not contravene the station's journalistic standards. The CRTC nevertheless sided with Lamour, ruling that Radio-Canada, given its preeminent status as a Canadian public media outlet, had not adequately put into place procedures to limit the use of the N-word and moderate its effects on audiences. The CRTC thus ordered Radio-Canada to apologize to the complainant in writing. Further, the regulator required the broadcaster to produce evidence that it was taking steps, undertaking internal measures, and implementing best practices to mitigate potential issues of a similar nature that might arise in the future. Needless to say, the CRTC ruling prompted heated public discussion in Canada about freedom of the press, appropriate journalistic conduct, and the censorship of sensitive on-air language. In a purely American context, the N-word is what one scholar calls the nuclear bomb of racial epithets. Writing in the Journal of Black Studies, Ohio State's Lanier Holt contends, few words are so abhorrent that just their utterance can provoke rage, hatred, and conflict. Holt argues the slur is so derisive that it has been consolidated into one letter because of the negative connotations associated with it. An early variation of the term in English can be traced to the Puritans and was already connected to the practice of slavery. The word had become recognizable in its current form by the time of the Revolutionary War and has remained forever derogatory in the lexicon of American speech, Holt notes. Given how the N-word blurs the line between speech and conduct, courts in the United States have focused their attention on banning the term as a form of hate speech. There have also been widespread institutional efforts to constrain the use of the N-word. Most people in Quebec familiar with Vallière's work understand that the author was not using the term in an American context, but rather as a metaphor for the centuries-old plight of Quebec francophones in English-speaking Canada. Since the British conquest of North America in 1760, the Catholic Church in French Canada, in partnership with the ruling English intelligentsia, infantilized the majority population and imposed on them their doctrines and educational methods. French Canadians, by and large, tolerated their subordinated relationship and accommodated their own oppression. Quebec was, Henry and Sheila Milner explain, an entity controlled from outside, a society which can act and decide only within the limits circumscribed by the colonizer. As John Conway elaborates, nationalists frequently evoke the image of Quebec as a colony of English Canada, and reality suggested the image was apt. The Quebecois nation was confined in a federal system that prevented self-determination and imposed constraints according to the will of English Canada. The system treated the Quebecois as second-class citizens economically and gave them fewer opportunities and lower incomes than English Canadians. The Quebecois language and culture were confined, suppressed, and marginalized. Most telling, of course, was that in Quebec itself, a small, powerful English minority enjoyed enormous privileges, economic, political, and cultural, while the Quebecois majority languished at the bottom of the heap. The chasm separating French and English in Quebec, therefore, emerges as a drama of colonization and defeat, a narrative of subjugation and a deeply rooted divide that today is euphemistically referred to as two solitudes, a coinage derived from Canadian author Hugh MacLennan's popular 1945 novel of the same name, and the accepted eponymous term Canadian scholars and media frequently use to imply the socio-cultural rift in the country between English and French speakers. Two Solitudes recounts the tale of a well-to-do Montreal industrialist of Scots ancestry who unwaveringly believes Canada's history is firmly rooted in two races, and that Canada is a place where each could be employed to balance the other. According to Charles Taylor, the two solitudes are like photographs of the same object taken from such different points of view that they cannot be superimposed. In the wake of the 1960 Quiet Revolution, Quebec francophones developed an increasingly acute awareness of their old unconscious environments, a term used by Marshall McLuhan. An environment is naturally of low intensity or low definition. That is why it escapes our attention. That's why it escapes observation, McLuhan observes. Hannah Arendt writes, "No one questions or examines what is obvious to all. The hegemony of the English-speaking environment that had for so long served to suppress any ambitions French speakers might have had soon propelled the province into violent confrontations throughout the 1960s. Quebec's need to unplug from French Canada's colonial past was not lost on Pierre Vallière, a member of the separatist Front de Libération du Québec. Vallière is best known for what Northrop Frye calls his manifesto of radical French-Canadian protest, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique. Written while Vallière was incarcerated here in New York City in the famous Tombs prison in Lower Manhattan, and published in 1968, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique compares the peripheralization of Quebec francophones to the plight of blacks in the United States. In the years leading up to the Quiet Revolution, it was fairly common for Canadians of both linguistic backgrounds to describe their distinctiveness in racial terms. They still do to some extent. Quebec francophones of a certain generation tell stories about why, as a rule, one had to be cautious while speaking French in public places in English-dominated Montreal before the Quiet Revolution. In at least one well-known downtown department store, customers addressing sales clerks in French typically would be admonished, "Speak white." Vallière, who had been touring US cities in an effort to link the struggles of Quebec francophones to the Black liberation movements in America, saw parallels between his fight and that of Malcolm X, assassinated 3 years earlier. "No sane Black man wants integration," Malcolm writes in his autobiography. "For the Black man in America, the only solution is complete separation from the white man." Such a racially tinged message already fit well into both the Anglophone and Francophone worldviews. perspectives that historically saw the two solitudes as divergent racial inheritances. But in reality, cloaking the two solitudes in the biological determinism of race had become, in Martin Lubin's view, a code word in Canadian political discourse for the much more complex conception of nationality. At the same time, Quebec Francophones and Anglophones were likely drawing parallels from news reports about mounting racial tensions south of the border. Francophone activists in particular were paying close attention to the ferment among Black Americans in northern urban ghettos from 1964 to 1967 that fostered the Black Power movement. Proponents of Black Power aimed to promote ethnic self-consciousness and group cohesion and believed white society should not be, as Anthony Appiah notes, part of what shapes the collective dimension of individual Black people in the United States. By the 1970 October crisis, Quebec's intellectuals, for whom the rest of Canada was Anglophone society writ large, had already begun to recognize the potential of Quebec's linguistic distinctiveness and, in general, reject outright the notion that Anglophone society should in any way determine the collective dimension of Francophone, being a Francophone in Quebec. After all, Taylor explains, English was the hegemonic language of Canada and North America. It is difficult for those who speak it even to understand what it could be like to live under linguistic threat. In 2023, a Canadian federal court ruled that the CRTC responded to Lamour's complaint incorrectly by citing subsection 3.1, the broadcast policy in question, in a disciplinary decision against SRC for its on-air use of the N-word. In a unanimous decision, the Federal Court of Appeal sided with the arguments put forth by the Attorney General of Canada and the public broadcaster. The court said that the broadcast regulator erred in the 2020 ruling on the complaint against Radio-Canada, especially noting that the CRT's response to the complaint cited sections of the Broadcasting Act that do not give the CRTC the authority to regulate broadcast speech. The CRTC had misinterpreted the meaning and spirit of subsection 3.1. Subsection 3.1 does not give the CRTC this power. The Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized that subsection 3.1 is not a jurisdiction conferring provision. Instead, its purpose is to describe the Broadcasting policy that Parliament was pursuing in adopting the Act. Federal Court of Appeal Chief Justice Marc Noel wrote in his decision. The court, recognizing nonetheless the CRT's authority to regulate broadcast speech, referred the decision back to the CRTC for review. The court has returned the matter to the CRTC. We will wait for their direction on next steps, a spokesman for CBC SRC communicated in a media statement. It is important to remember that this does not affect the policies we have already put in place to minimize the use of hurtful or offensive language. The court elaborated, the CRTC overstepped its jurisdiction by sanctioning the SRC on the sole basis that the content broadcast on the air was, in its opinion, inconsistent with the Canadian broadcasting policy. Justice Noel wrote that the CRTC decision might have cited the Canadian Association of Broadcasters' Equitable Portrayal Code, which cautions broadcasters about employing derogatory or inappropriate language. The CRTC imposed adherence to the code as a condition for granting SRC's broadcast license in the first place. The court also admonished the CRTC for ignoring SRC's right to freedom of expression under Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, urging the regulator to consider that right in any future ruling in the present case. It seems, however, that neither the initial CRTC ruling, SRC's subsequent rebuttal, nor the federal court's decision crafted their arguments and counter-arguments about the use of the N-word in any other context than the larger triggering frame implicit in its American usage. Together, the federal regulator, the federal broadcaster, and the federal court, pursuing a very narrow legal resolution into the case, missed an opportunity to cast their deliberations in a way that would shed light on cross-linguistic subtleties, Valliere's intentional metaphorical use of the term, and on much of the fraught history of Quebec province. Thank you.